I had grown up with the myth, so far back that I don't recall where I picked it up, that Germans had saved Missouri for the Union. Coming to grad school at Mizzou, in the wake of the radical 60s, it was fashionable to re-examine and challenge old myths. But the more I looked into this one, the more evidence that I found that it was largely true. So in effect, I'm revising the revisionists. As I'll show in the course of my talk, Missouri Germans stood out both from others in their state and from Germans elsewhere in the country in their degree of support for Lincoln, Union, and emancipation. I have two explanations for this. First of all, Missouri Germans were directly exposed to slavery in a way that few other Germans were, but in contrast to their compatriots down in Texas, here they were numerous enough and had enough Anglo allies that they could speak out on slavery without unduly risking life and limb. Secondly, the way the Republican Party developed in Missouri out of a Democratic split rather than as a successor to the Whigs eased the partisan transition for Germans. Revisionists have sometimes cast doubt on whether Germans were really that opposed to slavery on principle, arguing instead that it was merely poverty that kept them from owning slaves. And if you look at the slave schedules in German counties, you will find among the owners a few of the more prosperous immigrants. But the contrast we see in slave ownership, hey, it works, were so great that they could hardly have been come about except through a conscious decision of Germans against human property. Nor does the poverty argument hold up. I investigated patterns of slave owning in my native St. Charles County, where German and native-born farmers were about equal in numbers, but less than 3% of the slaves there in 1850 were owned by Germans. These contrasts hold up at every level of wealth, as you can see. 1/5 of all Americans without any real estate nevertheless owned slaves, but not a single German. Also, among farmers owning less than $1,000 worth of real estate, 28% of the natives, but less than 1% of the Germans owned slaves. The tendency did increase with greater wealth, but even up to the highest level, only half of the Germans, but over 90% of the natives owned slaves. In Cape Girardeau County, the contrast is starker yet. Even if you include one Alsatian, there were only 4 German slave owners owning a total of 8 slaves, a mere 0.5% of the county's 1,533 slaves. Moreover, even the few Germans who owned slaves did not appear to be especially wedded to the peculiar institution. Several German slave owners from my part of the state became leading and even radical members of the Republican Party. Among them, the brothers Friedrich and George Munch, there's Friedrich, in Augusta, and Arnold Krakel and Gustav Brewer in St. Charles. The letters of the Bruns family, founders of a German Catholic settlement in Osage County, give some insight into the decision process. When the Democratic Party split into pro-slavery and free soil wings, Dr. Bernard Bruns held to the latter. Later, he became a zealous Republican who helped nominate Lincoln and served as a surgeon in the Union Army. There you can see him in uniform. This may seem paradoxical given that he was a slave owner and a Catholic to boot. Part of the explanation is that he was typical of neither of Catholics nor of slave owners. It was no easy decision to become personally involved in slavery. In the case of Dr. Bruns, his wife Jette was obviously involved in the decision-making, as is apparent from her letter of April 1845 to her brother back in Germany. I'm sorry if you were offended that we had some blacks. Indeed, I do not feel very good about it either. Blacks are frequently good for nothing, but our Mary loves the children and is always very cheerful. I wouldn't do without her for anything. Now comes perhaps the decisive point. White girls are very pretentious and rarely stay very long. Last summer we had a good girl, but after 3 months she had to marry, although she had hired out for longer. In the 1850 census, until they relocated to Jefferson City, the Bruns family owned a slave couple with a child, but then Jette reported something remarkable. The black folks chose a new master. It appears that the scarcity of white domestic servants proved decisive in Germans' decisions to acquire slaves. Many men of the servant-keeping class back home thought they had put their wives through enough just by immigrating without making them do without domestic help or trying to get along with white servants who were both scarce and unreliable. The partisan development of Missouri in this era was also unusual. In most of the North, the Republican Party developed in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, uniting farmer Whigs with a small infusion of anti-Nebraska Democrats and Free Soilers. The roots of Missouri's Republicans go back as far as 1848, though not under that name. Missouri Germans had long been closely allied with the Democratic Party. Editor Heinrich Bornstein claimed there were just 3 German Whigs in all St. Louis, only a slight exaggeration judging by the election returns. Germans were particularly loyal to Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Dr. Bruns described the so-called Jackson resolutions in which, quote, the legislature of Missouri instructed its members of Congress to vote for the expansion of slavery into the new territories. But our celebrated old Senator Thomas Hart Benton has appealed to the people of Missouri against the resolution of the legislature. Bruns met Benton personally at a convention in St. Louis, and the senator arranged to send his son Randolph to live with the Bruns family and learn German and French. Benton's Free Soil stance cost him a Senate seat, but he was elected to the House in 1852 from a St. Louis district thanks to German support. 2 of Benton's lieutenants, cousins Frank Blair and B. Gratz Brown, carried on the Free Soil fight down to the 1860 election with strong German support. But Germans didn't just let themselves be led blindly in politics. The pro-slavery Democrats had a spokesman, Thomas Reynolds, who had attended the University of Heidelberg and spoke fluent German. But in 1860, a St. Louis German newspaper advised him to stick to Goethe and Schiller. Quote, both were apostles of freedom, and if they lived among us, they would vote for the Democratic ticket, not. The not always comes last in German, you know. So Germans in Missouri didn't have to change parties to support Lincoln as they did elsewhere in the country. Missouri Republicans, rather than springing up from Whig ashes, arose out of a Democratic split between the pro-slavery and Free Soil wings, whereas many conservative former Whigs became Democrats. This odd party evolution was reflected in the St. Louis press during and after the Civil War. The leading Democratic paper was the Missouri Republican, its name derived from an old name for the Whigs, National Republicans. Reflecting its Free Soil Democratic roots, the leading Republican paper was called the Democrat. Come to think of it, it was still called that back when I was a kid. St. Charles also had a Republican Democrat, but spelled with a K instead of a C because it was in German. This brings us to the 1860 election. Missouri found itself in the middle, figuratively as well as literally, at a time when it was normal to be at one of the extremes. It was the only state where each of the 4 presidential candidates won at least 10% of the popular vote. Lincoln came in last, but he received 3 times as many votes there as he did in Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia combined, even including what would become West Virginia. One reason was that Missouri had more Germans than the other 3 states combined. Like the national presidential race, the state gubernatorial contest held 3 months earlier was a 4-way race. The winner, Claiborne Fox Jackson, claimed to support Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, but he turned out to be a secessionist after all. Now, if you're still wondering what the Civil War was really about, let me give it to you from the horse's mouth, Governor Jackson's inaugural address of January 61. In which he called upon Missouri to make, quote, a timely declaration of her determination to stand by her sister slaveholding states in whose wrongs she participates and with whose institutions and people she sympathizes. Had it not been for Missouri Germans, he might have gotten away with it. In all of the slave states, Lincoln carried only 2 counties, both in Missouri. Not coincidentally, they were the two most heavily German in the state, Gasconade and St. Louis. The slide shows voting in the 9 most heavily German counties arranged by a descending German percentage. The right column shows Lincoln's percentage of the total vote. The middle column shows what share of the vote he received in a two-way split with Douglas. And since virtually no Germans voted for the 2 Southern candidates, the middle column probably represents the minimum percent Germans supporting Lincoln. In fact, my estimates based on ward-level data find 80% of the St. Louis Germans voting for Lincoln. The support is the more remarkable considering that most of them were Catholic or Lutheran, just like they are down here, and their clerical leaders had little sympathy for the Republicans. The Catholic hierarchy had no problems with slavery. Both in St. Louis and here locally, there were Catholic institutions that owned a few slaves. One Catholic scholar wrote, "To join the Republican Party was tantamount to joining forces with the devil." And a Lutheran journal found the leaders of the Missouri Synod, quote, "Republican neither by inclination nor in party affiliation." But the laity often saw things differently. A German in the Catholic seminary in Cape Girardeau, or maybe it was the Barrens, was so outraged by the Southern sympathies of an Irish professor that he transferred his theological studies to Milwaukee. On the Lutheran side, C.F.W. Walther, the founder of the Missouri Synod, was challenged by laymen in his own St. Louis congregation for his views that slavery was divinely sanctioned. To attract 80% of the St. Louis German vote, Lincoln must have gained a majority of both Lutherans and Catholics. It had to be Catholics supporting Lincoln in Osage County because there were virtually no other Germans there. The weak showing of the Republicans in Perry County is no doubt due to its claim as the cradle of the Missouri Synod Lutheranism, but precinct returns in St. Charles County show another charter member of the Synod, Neumelli, voting over 80% for Lincoln. One surprise is the low Lincoln vote in Warren County, home of elder statesman Friedrich Munch, but his influence may have been limited by the fact that the county had no German language newspaper. The same thing could be said of Cape County, which only got its first German paper in the 1870s. Its Lincoln support was right at the state average. Now, the German percentage of the Lincoln vote is even more impressive than the Lincoln percentage of the German vote. The other 105 counties, besides the 9 in the table, accounted for less than 30% of Lincoln's statewide vote. Now, granted, many Anglos in St. Louis were cautious Unionists, but Germans were the city's most enthusiastic supporters of Union and emancipation. The first shots of the Civil War in Missouri were fired on the streets of St. Louis on May 10, 1861, in a riot with strong ethnic overtones. Wide-awake German militia companies had been drilling since the election and, in cooperation with several Anglo-Unionist politicians, played a decisive role in preventing the federal arsenal from falling into Confederate hands. So far, so good, but when they captured the secessionist state militia at Camp Jackson and marched them through the streets, it triggered a riot that left 28 dead in its wake. Although this no doubt pushed some fence-sitters over to the Confederate side, Germans provided much of the manpower that quickly put the Union in control of this crucial border state. One Southern belle wrote from the city 10 days after the Camp Jackson affair, "My blood boils in my veins when I think of the position of Missouri, held in the Union at the point of Dutchmen's bayonets." As late as the Battle of Pea Ridge in March 1862, Germans, most of them Missourians, made up between 1/3 and half of the Union forces involved. 2 Missouri German regiments that fought there, the 12th and the 17th, served with distinction throughout the war, and 2 leading German generals, the famous Franz Sigel and the more competent but less heralded Peter Joseph Osterhaus, started their careers from Missouri. Missouri Germans had a high level of Union Army participation compared not only to other Missourians, but also to other Germans nationwide. Though Missouri had only the sixth largest German population in 1860, it was second only to New York in the number of Germans who rallied to the blue. Wisconsin Germans sizably outnumbered those in Missouri, but Missouri Germans supplied nearly twice the number of Union troops. The differences were especially pronounced at the outset of the war when service was purely voluntary. Most Germans considered slavery to be incompatible with a true republic, but that is not the only reason they opposed secession. They also resented the attitudes that slave ownership engendered among its practitioners. The majority of Missouri's Anglo-Americans were of Southern heritage or persuasion, and they had little respect for free speech or the peaceful political process when the subject of slavery was at stake. Elder statesman Friedrich Munch editorialized in 1862 against, quote, the shameful fact that we were not free men in this so-called free country as long as the slave owners could control us at a whim. Even if we said nothing whatsoever, were not these grand gentlemen suspicious of our inner thoughts because we seldom stood out as praisers of the institution? Now, before you discount this as the exaggeration of a German radical, consider what artist George Caleb Bingham, who himself owned a couple of slaves, relates in an 1856 letter from Europe. In Paris, he met the U.S. minister who, upon hearing that he was a Missourian, mistakenly assumed his sympathies with the border ruffians, his word, not mine. This brought up the whole matter of the sectional controversy, and as there was no cudgel over my head or mob at hand to apply tar and feathers, I felt at liberty to return thrust for thrust. He is a politician of that ultra-Southern school who deem the right to own Negroes and take them where they please as the only right in the world worth contending for. A good example of how slavery perverted the electoral process took place just a couple of miles from the farm where I grew up. The St. Charles Democrat reported in the aftermath of the 1860 presidential election, quote, 2 Americans driven out of house and home because they voted for Lincoln. In, quote, a part of the county populated mostly by slaveholders, unquote, 2 brothers who had recently moved in from Illinois went separately to the polls and attempted to vote for Lincoln. They were told that, quote, no damn black Republican votes would be cast in Hayes Mill, beaten up and warned to leave the country within 3 days. The Democrat got its story directly from the victims on their way out, but many details were verified by election returns and census entries. Such tactics of intimidation were applied wholesale against Germans where they were in the minority. As the Democrat reported, before and after the November elections, the Germans were set in fear and fright, and the next year brought no improvement. In May '61, the Democrat described as a, quote, reign of terror conditions under which Unionists in Warren County were living, mentioning several incidents where Germans were run out by mob action. Similar conditions were reported from this country by immigrant Lewis Miller, who wrote back to Germany. There were also a lot of people who sided with the Confederal states. I couldn't stay any longer in my hometown, Jackson, where I lived, so on September 12, 1861, I moved away from there to the town of Cape Girardeau, where it was much safer. By the next month, he was wearing the blue. The Civil War almost started early in New Melle as a result of a polling place brawl between Germans and Anglos in the February '61 election to decide whether Missouri should stay in the Union. Only the intervention of the sheriff prevented an armed clash involving dozens of people. One of the people arrested was my great-great-grandpa, Conrad Weinreich. By the summer of 1861, he was busy organizing a Unionist Home Guard company at New Melle, of which he was elected captain. At the county level, efforts were headed up by lawyer and newspaper editor. Oh, there's your letter from Cape Girardeau. At the county level, the efforts are headed up by newspaper publisher Arnold Krakel. All told, he raised 12 companies comprising over 1,300 men in the Home Guard unit known as Krakel's Dutch. It's apparent from the communities involved and the names of some of the officers that Catholics as well as Protestants were rallying to the cause. The 1885 history of St. Charles County states, this regiment did valuable service for the Union cause by holding St. Charles County and not only preventing the enlistment of the Southern volunteers here, but keeping down Southern organizations and enlistments farther north. Crakel's Dutch, as they were called, stood a dreaded menace to the active Southern element in all this part of the country. Some of what they're talking about is indicated by an 1862 letter from Conrad Weinrich to his St. Louis relatives describing a month-long deployment in the area around Mexico and on down to Fulton, which he characterizes as, quote, the headquarters of the Secesh in North Missouri. The entire time, we got nothing from the government but a couple of barrels of crackers and some coffee. All the rest we had to take from the Secesh because there was no other way to get anything. We had our food and drink provided by the Secesh when we found some, and when they didn't want to cook for us, we threatened to take everything away from them and cook for ourselves. But then they livened up and cooked what we wanted to have. But if Unionists did not exactly handle secessionists with kid gloves, their actions were relatively mild compared to what happened when the numerical advantage was reversed. Germans in more isolated communities away from the major settlements were in constant danger of violence by pro-Confederate bushwhackers and guerrillas, who often assumed that simply being German was evidence enough of being a Unionist. Germans in Concordia were especially hard hit. As a recent Mizzou Press book has shown, nearly 1/5 of its military-age men died at the hands of guerrillas or as military casualties, more like the Confederacy than the Union in its level of losses. Other isolated communities had similar experiences. Despite these Southern or slaveholding sympathies of their Lutheran pastor, Germans in Coal Camp eagerly enlisted in the Unionist Home Guard, but just 6 days after they were mustered in, their encampment was surprised by Confederates on June 19, 1861, in an attack that left dozens of them dead. Throughout the war, they were subject to the depredations of Confederate bushwhackers. Another German settlement even farther up the Osage, Deepwater in Henry County, was Catholic, but it was equally Unionist. As the diocesan history relates, the church was used as a Union barracks, and 26 members of this small parish served, 3 of them giving their lives for the Union. Every German community of size had one or several individuals who stepped up to take the lead in military and political affairs. In Cape Girardeau, it was above all George Thelenius, whose decisiveness belied his youthful appearance. Relatively well educated by age 19, when he arrived with his family in 1848, he worked in his father's St. Louis store until taking a position at a sugar refinery in Cuba from 1853 to 56. Arriving in Cape Girardeau the following year, he established himself in general merchandise before the war. After the war, he founded a very successful flour milling business, served 3 terms as city mayor, and built a fine house, Longview, which is still standing today, not 2 blocks from Central High School. Thelenius helped organize the first Union troops in Cape Girardeau, most of whom were fellow Germans. From Ehlers to Ziegler, at least 4/5 of the 342 names on the rolls of the county home guards were Germans. The same could be said of 2/3, if not 3/4, of Adolph Taki's Missouri militia unit raised in 1864. There was one Cape Girardeau militia unit that was largely Anglo, Captain Ezra King's company, but it was not established till April 1865. Guess they could tell which way the wind was blowing by then. Cape Girardeau had the disadvantage, it's the last red one there, of being the farthest south of all the state's major German communities, but it had the advantage of being on the Mississippi. With the Union controlling the river, Cape could be easily reinforced and was vulnerable at most to quick raids. It was also protected by 4 strong forts whose construction Thelenius had supervised. Attacking them, as John Marmaduke's raiders did in April 1863, quote, approached the insane, according to Civil War historian Stephen Oates. Sterling Price's raid in the fall of 1864 provided another scare, but came no closer than Jackson, where 18 men and 40 horses were captured by a Confederate detachment. Other German communities just south of the Missouri River were not as fortunate, as one immigrant woman described from near Washington. Then the rebels, Commander Price, Marmaduke, and Shelby, went on a rampage through Missouri, stealing and plundering everything they could get their hands on, especially men's wares and horses. Only the hot pursuit of the Union Army kept it from being any worse. In the mopping up operations in the aftermath, a Union force from Cape ventured all the way into Arkansas, commanded by Colonel Thelenius. Although German Americans are certainly not immune to self-congratulation, witnesses of various backgrounds attested to Missouri Germans' devotion to the Union cause. Abolitionist Baptist preacher Galusha Anderson may have had reservations about their beer drinking, but he stated that, quote, the Germans of the city, with hardly an exception, were openly and stoutly opposed to secession. Beer drinking and unionism seem to have gone together, as an Anglo soldier related upon returning to St. Louis from the 1861 Southwest Missouri campaign. I never put my head out of the hotel, but that, having on my first Iowa uniform, the first German who saw me took me by the arm to the nearest beer saloon and said, "You fights mit Siegel, you drinks mit me." Despite Germans' impatience with the Lincoln administration, their fervor continued throughout the war, as a French traveler confirmed in 1864. It is perhaps among the German population of St. Louis that we must look for the most ardent defenders of the Union and the most resolute enemies of slavery. The, quote, extreme bitterness against St. Louis Germans held by many Southern sympathizers is beyond dispute. As the Reverend Anderson delicately observed, more than once I heard them hotly denounce the Germans as Amsterdam Dutch without the Amster. But rather than relying entirely on such anecdotes, I also checked out the numbers using the Missouri State Archive Soldiers Database along with Ancestry.com 1860 Census Index to make a quick and dirty approximation of ethnicity and recruitment. I simply took 2 of the most common English and German names, Smith and Jones versus Schmidt and Meyer, and for good measure throw in the Irish names Murphy and Walsh, and tallied the numbers with those surnames on Union and Confederate muster rolls relative to the number of males of military age with these names in the census. For Union units, there are often multiple rolls, and many of the Confederate records have not been preserved, but that should not introduce an ethnic bias as long as you stay in any one column. For every male Schmidt of military age, there were nearly 5 Schmidts on Missouri Union muster rolls. Myers come in slightly lower, but also well above the Smiths and Joneses. Averaging the 2 German names together, you come up with more than 3 hits on the Union rolls for every man of military age. For the Anglo names, it's only half as many, and the Irish figures are even lower. The contrasts on the Confederate rolls were even more stark. There were 201 men named Smith and 124 named Jones listed among Missouri's rebels, but in those same units, there was not a single Schmidt and only 1 Meyer, and he was a native of Switzerland. Although Irish showed a greater propensity to serve the Confederacy than Germans, they did not keep up with the Joneses or the Smiths, only about half as high per capita. Now, even if the evidence of Germans' loyalty to the Union is overwhelming, this does not entirely clarify what they were fighting for. There were Northern Democrats enough from General McClellan on down whose war aims were the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was, that is to say, leaving slavery unchanged. This was not, however, the view of Missouri Germans, as one militiaman wrote from Franklin County, welcoming Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. "Slavery is the sole cause of this disastrous war. Germans did not intend to leave it in place." As you will note in this 1862 broadside, obviously aimed at Civil War recruits, a largely unknown version of a very well-known song, it's flanked not only by a soldier in a Zouave uniform with a funny German hat, but also by a bondsman breaking his chains. Missouri Germans were well out in front of the Lincoln administration on this issue. When the president removed General John Fremont from command after he refused to rescind his premature slave confiscation order in August 1861, caused a near riot among St. Louis Germans. But support for emancipation was not restricted to the big city. Despite its name, the German weekly St. Charles Democrat was strongly Republican and often carried articles by elder statesman Friedrich Münch. For example, in May of 1862, quote, "The difference in outward appearance between whites and Africans is much greater than the difference in natural intellectual ability. There are blacks aplenty who even show outstanding mental capacity and with appropriate education exceed thousands of whites." In the next week's issue, Münch continued with arguments for the natural right of blacks, quote, "in the land of their birth, their fatherland, in which they have worked for centuries, and with their sweat and blood created immeasurable wealth for others, not Africa, but the USA." In October 62, Münch went Lincoln one better with an article, quote, "on the necessity of immediate emancipation." The month before, the Democrat noted with satisfaction, "The Negroes in St. Charles County are wising up. The majority of them have stopped working for their masters." Within the readership, there was no unanimity, but certainly a broad consensus in support of emancipation. Beginning in March 1863, a dispute went on for weeks in the pages of the Democrat because a German militia captain had helped to recapture a fugitive slave. But even the target of the critique stated in his own defense, "I am no slavery propaganda force." Apparently not everyone had learned his lesson. October 63 saw a very similar case. A German from my hometown of Augusta had betrayed a fugitive slave and helped to recapture him. Thereupon a protest meeting was called, the guilty party removed from his offices on the school board and the Savings Association, and a group of 50 armed Germans set out for the slave owners and set the fugitive free again. With legal measures, as with extra-legal emancipation, Germans did not remain idle. Gert Goebel, representing Franklin County in the legislature, expressed his frustrations not only with the pro-slavery forces, but also with the gradual emancipationist faction. Quote, "They reminded me of the peasant who wanted to dock his dog's tail, but so as not to subject the poor beast to too much pain at once, he cut off a little piece every day until it reached the desired sharpness." When Missouri's emancipation law was finally passed in January 65, many of its strongest supporters were German, among them Cape Girardeau's Thelenius. Chairing the convention was fellow German Arnold Krakel of St. Charles County. Krakel continued his career in Jefferson City after Lincoln named him a federal judge. He, along with evangelical pastor Joseph Rieger, were among the strongest supporters of the Lincoln Institute, the predecessor of Lincoln University, and both served on its first board of directors. More than 20 years after the war, Krakel still served on the 6-member board, along with another German American, and offered courses without pay in the subjects of government and political economy for this historically black college. Continuing into the Reconstruction era, Missouri Germans were more active than ever in politics, usually on the Republican side. In July 1866, Cape Girardeau saw the founding of a Union Veterans Society, the Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, only the second chapter to be established nationwide. Along with fraternal and mutual aid functions, it in effect served as a Republican auxiliary. Heading the list of its charter members was Colonel Thelenius and 5 other Germans. 4 had Anglo names, but it's striking who was missing. 2 members were from Ireland and 1 from Scotland. The sole American native was born in New York of Welsh parentage, not a single native Missourian. Along with Thelenius, a record number of German Americans were elected to the 1866 Missouri legislature. 12 other representatives and 5 senators, all but 2 of the 18 Republicans. One of the most important tasks of the Reconstruction era was to determine the legal status of freed slaves, a subject of considerable controversy. Right away in February 65, Frederick Munch had introduced a bill for the education of black children. Whether separate from whites or integrated would be left to the local school board. In Augusta, where his brother George lived, black children initially attended school with whites. Already during the 1865 Constitutional Convention, Thelenius and another German had objected to the word white as a qualification for the governor's office. St. Louis legislator Gustav Finkelberg was the leading force for black voting rights. But the most radical statement I have encountered from Germans on the race issue stems not from the city, but from a village blacksmith, my great-great-grandfather. Quote, as reported in the St. Charles Sentinel, Mr. Weinrich from New Malley, the radical candidate for the legislature, is said to have recently told some gentlemen that he regards the Negro as quite his equal in political and social terms. He also remarked that if 4 of his 5 daughters were to marry white men and 1 married a Negro, he would treat his black son-in-law just like the white husbands of his other daughters. Now, this was printed in an anti-radical paper and might be exaggerated, and none of his daughters put him to the test. But if it was intended to damage the candidate in the eyes of his countrymen, it completely misfired. Weinrich reported shortly after the election, we elected the entire radical ticket without exception, and the conservatives are hanging their heads. I heard that 2 days after the election, the barbers in St. Charles were charging double the price to shave a conservative because their faces are so long now. In case you're wondering, the conservatives were the Democrats and the radicals were the Republicans. Now, judging by his letters, Weinrich's spelling was rather shaky in both German and English, but loyalty to the Union and decisiveness when the chips were down were obviously more important to the local German voters than higher education. Though Weinrich took little legislative initiative, the voters were pleased enough with his performance to elect him for a second term. And one of the few actions does confirm his radical reputation. When the new regulations for the University of Missouri were being drawn up, there was a motion to delete a clause that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race or gender. Weinrich demanded a roll call vote in a futile attempt to save the clause. I guess you'd say he was 90 years ahead of his time. Mizzou went co-ed fairly early, but it took till I was in grade school before it was racially integrated. The Bruins family also stayed the course unerringly throughout the Civil War. A son and a stepson both gave their lives for the Union on the battlefield. Dr. Bruins himself served as a military physician and Republican mayor of Jefferson City until his death in 1864. Too bad that Bruins did not live to see this, was his wife's reaction when a radical Republican took over the governor's office in 1865. Left in tight financial straits, Widow Bruins was assisted by Arnold Krakel, who had bought his house lot from her. She turned her home into a boarding house for legislators, and Krakel, who was a frequent guest, called it the Radical Corner. Among her boarders were many of the leading German Republicans I've mentioned: Friedrich Munch, Gerd Goebel, Konrad Weinrich, Gustav Finkelberg, Gustav Brewer, and a few Anglo-Americans such as the lieutenant governor. But apparently not Thelenius. Maybe he could afford a hotel. Along with the 1868 presidential election, Missouri held a referendum on the enfranchisement of blacks. The German-language press in a number of towns weighed in supporting the amendment. For example, the St. Charles Democrat, which called Negro equality, quote, a boogeyman with which the Democrats are trying to terrify and intimidate the local populace. Both the Democrat and the St. Louis Westliche Post placed blacks in positive comparisons. The Post asking, is that justice? The rebels used their intellect only to plunge the country into ruin, whereas the Negro faithfully helped to save our Union. A week later, the venerable Frederick Munch posed another contrast in the Democrat. Even drunken Irishmen and other wastrels with white skin may come to the ballot box. For them, a decent black girl would almost be too good. The Irish also served as a whipping boy for the appropriately named Jefferson City Fortschritt, whose name translates to progress. If the Irishman is an ignorant person and votes for the Democratic ticket, why shouldn't we radicals allow the perhaps equally ignorant Negro to vote for the radical ticket? But as ignorant as the average Irishman, the Negro is not. These somewhat demagogic tones suggest that the rank and file were not as progressive in their racial views as the editor of the Fortschritt, which is confirmed by a police report from the previous week. 2 men were fined $3 each for, quote, beating up a Negro boy. Their ethnicity quite apparent from their names, Christ Herchenröder and John Rockerman. And the clippings from your Democratic local paper gives you some idea what supporters of black suffrage were up against. No rose without thorns was the reaction of the Westliche Post to the vote on black enfranchisement. Right remains right whether it achieves victory on the first attempt or not. If one examines the election returns and compares the number of supporting votes with the number of Republican votes for Grant, it's apparent that less than half of all Grant supporters also favored black enfranchisement. The deficit was just as high in the German wards of St. Louis as in other parts of the city. Republicans held the line on black suffrage better in Cape County than in many places. Although it lost while Grant carried the county, the fall-off on the Republican side was only 22%, with 11% of Grant supporters opposing black enfranchisement and another 11% abstaining. Precinct returns in St. Charles County show that Conrad Weinrich's hometown of New Malley was not nearly as radical as he was. It cast nearly double the number of votes for Grant as for black voting rights. Things looked better in 2 other German precincts of the county, probably because of the leadership of Latin farmers such as Munch. Femosage saw only a fourth of the Grant supporters defect, and in Augusta, where I went to grade school, only 5 of the 146 Grant supporters opposed black suffrage, and another 6 abstained. That may be the best precinct returns in the whole state for black suffrage. Missouri returned to Democratic control via the liberal Republican movement of 1872, which initially had considerable German support. This might suggest that Germans had abandoned Reconstruction and their black allies. But more than race or reconciliation, the issue of corruption was particularly relevant in Missouri, where the whiskey ring originated. German radicals, for all their differences with authoritarian Prussia, still missed its incorruptible bureaucrats. Their enthusiasm for the liberal Republican movement largely evaporated with the nomination of teetotaler Horace Greeley. Carl Schurz captured their mood on the evening of Greeley's nomination when he sat down at the piano and played Chopin's Funeral March. After their flirtation with the liberal Republican movement in 1872, Missouri Germans largely returned to the Republican fold. Carl Schurz found he didn't have the German vote in his pocket anymore. In fact, Schurz himself later returned to the Republican fold. But if you examine the pre-war Anglo-American standard bearers, Thomas Hart Benton never became a Republican, even when his son-in-law, Fremont, was running for president in 1856. His two leading lieutenants, Frank Blair and B. Gratz Brown, despite their Republican affiliations during the war, ended their careers as Democrats. Few Germans did unless they were Catholic. So one has to ask, who was pushing whom in the 1850s? It's obvious that Germans were not just voting cattle led around by Anglo leaders. Their hearts were in the struggle for union and freedom, and many of them were willing to put their lives on the line for the cause. In closing, let me briefly raise a final issue: how well this German idealism in matters of race held up over time. A quote by Thelenius' son Edward in the History of Southeast Missouri, published just 100 years ago, is quite instructive. Quoting it here: "One of the great problems of the age is the color question, and it is just as much a problem today as it was 50 years ago when the Negroes were the cause of the contention between the North and the South. For the most part, those who were influential in freeing the slaves have passed beyond the difficulty, and to their descendants is left the task of deciding what shall be done with the colored race. George C. Thelenius was a member of the convention which abolished slavery in the state of Missouri, had no more difficult task than his son, who lives in the age whose business it is to establish the status of the Negro in the state and country." Thelenius the Younger was still a Republican, but at least from this quote, it's difficult to say just where he stood on matters of race. While he may have considered blacks his clients, it does not appear that he viewed them as allies. Thank you.